Well, hey everybody, it's Sandy and welcome back to my channel dedicated to helping you advocate for your own health one topic at a time. So guys, right now, at least in my area and in a lot of people's areas, I know the Delta variant is just raging. And as people who've been watching my channel know that I have been vaccinated with Moderna, and I still get a lot of questions from people like, will I do this? Or how do I decide whether I'm going to do that and when? And I realized, I sort of have a flow chart in my head and an analogy that I use to help guide me. And I want to share that with you today. I'm going to call it the big analogy. Yeah, so if anybody thinks of a better title for this video, one that, in a few words can sort of encapsulate what I'm going to be talking about, let me know and I'll actually think about editing it because I'm going to have a tough time coming up with a video title for this. I've been trying to help people all along, actually, even before we had vaccines. I had a lot of people contact me, and very often it was about like one variable. So most of you have been following me for a while know that I started reviewing masks very early on in the pandemic when people just didn't really know what they were looking at and what to buy. And I had developed mask criteria, and very early on I was limiting my search for masks to those that had polypropylene in the center, at least for fabric masks. By the way, here's a tangent. That's a bit of a misnomer. In retrospect, I wish I hadn't called that the fabric mask, because if polypropylene is a fabric, but it seems that now when I hear masks talked about by any of the experts out there giving guidance, when they say fabric mask, for whatever reason, they're excluding polypropylene. So when they say fabric masks, they're really talking about masks that are made out of like cotton and nylon and whatever, but they're not talking about the non-wovens. I don't know, I wish I would have named my categories differently now in retrospect. So suffice it to say that when you hear some direction out there about fabric masks, I would respectfully say that it likely excludes fabric masks that I have been recommending here on my channel, because those do include the polypropylene layers, and therefore that's not what's really considered a fabric mask at that level. So I had people contacting me very early on, and they were asking me, what should I wear? What mask should I get? And typically we would embark on a conversation that had more to do with lots of other factors, not just the mask. It's hard to expect everything you need out of just one mitigation measure. For example, I would often have teachers contacting me and saying they're in a classroom full of students and maybe they weren't required to wear masks. And I would start always with the larger mitigation issues. So for example, I would say, do you have windows? Can you get windows open and fans running? All the better yet if you have windows on two different walls so that you can get some cross ventilation going. Maybe you can even teach some classes outside. And after we were done with that whole discussion about what they could do or couldn't do about their environment, then I would try to hone in on a mask recommendation for them based on all those other things. So there's a lot of moving parts, and I think sometimes we can get sort of down a rabbit hole where we're really myopic and we're focusing on one thing, one mitigation measure. And it's really important to back up and look at the whole picture and all its moving parts and distill it down to one good decision. So I came up with an analogy about how I try to make my decisions about what I'll do, what I won't do at any given time. How many of you who are vaccinated have heard from people who are like anti-vax that have said, well, you're vaccinated, so just act it. Why don't you can just do everything now, as though the vaccine, while it's the heaviest hitter, as though it's perfect. Don't even get me started on that. A good start is having the vaccine, of course. So I came up with this analogy to help people understand sort of the process that's going on in my head, where I'm keeping track of lots of different variables, or more specifically, lots of different mitigation measures at the same time. And then I'm also keeping track of the conditions around me that I have no control over. And the analogy I came up with is like flying a plane. I don't know how to fly a plane. I do know how to give anesthesia, and very often there are comparisons made. So like we put people to sleep and wake people up, that's often referred to as a takeoff and a landing, and there's the coasting period. And there are a lot of similarities in that you have an equipment check beforehand and you have various safety measures in place. So same thing, I would think, if you're going to learn to fly a plane, and there are certain prerequisites that without you just couldn't even get started. So you do have to have the appropriate education, and you have to have some kind of a license, I would think, and you have to have a certain number of hours under your belt where you've been learning to fly under somebody's supervision. And then in addition to that, you have all kinds of safety measures that are incorporated into the flight, right? You have a seatbelt, probably have a safety checklist. So before you're getting ready to take off, you'd have to go through that checklist. And then in addition to that, you probably have some alarms and measures that are there so that they can warn you when something goes wrong. And since we know that people who do things a lot are the ones who tend to be better at them, if you're well practiced at something, you're more likely to be better at it than somebody who isn't. I'm going to make the assumption that the more time you have under your belt, the more experience you have, those factors are all going to work together to help you become extremely skilled, and your bag of tricks will be pretty full. So where's the analogy here? Bear with me. So people ask me how I decide what I'll do and what I won't do. So I'm vaccinated. Like, why aren't I going to the grocery store right now? You know, a few months ago, I talked about here on my channel that my husband and I started getting together indoors with a few friends, maybe 6 people who were all vaccinated, having dinner parties, and we've now walked that back. So let me explain why. So let's take the plane, for example. The license is the very basic prerequisite for being safe. There's a minimum standard there, and I'm going to liken that to the vaccine. I know it's not a perfect analogy, but to my mind, all you have to do is look at the data. The vaccine is what separates the extreme risk from the relative safety. So let's say I've got my license, my vaccine, and let's say I've got a lot of experience. That's a safeguard. Let's say I know I'm going to wear the seat belts and use whatever other safety measures are there that are supposed to be engaged during flight. So I'm going to say that's like the mask and maybe eye protection. But let's say I'm about ready to take off and some report comes in about unexpected weather. And even though I might be completely competent at flying this plane, at solving problems that might come up, and I'm a very safe, experienced pilot, if I get this notice that there's some kind of a bad storm coming in, maybe there's a hurricane or electrical storm, I'm probably not going to go out on that plane. So it's kind of like, I know I have the vaccine, but right now, the infection rate, which is the issue that's outside of my control and it's all around me. So I think that's kind of like the weather. When I see the infection rate is as high as it is in my community and hospitals are full, and can I tell you, hospitals are really full. We have patients who should be in intensive care sitting in emergency rooms. Emergency rooms are no place for patients that need intensive care. An emergency room is not set up for following people and altering the treatment and reevaluating them every few minutes, which is what's going on in an intensive care unit. We have people sitting in ambulances because there's not even room in the emergency room yet. And then we have people out in the community who need 911 and there's like no ambulance sometimes because the ambulances are sitting outside the emergency rooms for hours because they can't even drop a patient off at the emergency room in the hospitals. I think of the infection rate as kind of the weather. You know, and when clouds roll in, you might have all kinds of wind and rain and visibility issues and all kinds of dangers. And that has to kind of be your barometer and your decision-making tool that kind of trumps the other things, even though you have your safety measures. I think people get what I'm saying. So even though I've had the vaccine, when the infection rate is as high as it is, and things are just out and about are as dangerous and grave as they are right now, that tells me that I'm going to dial back. There's just more virus to bump into. Really, there's just more bad weather to bump into. My chances of getting sick are much higher than when the infection rate is low. Now I'm vaccinated. I'm probably not going to end up in the intensive care unit, but I don't really want to get sick with this thing either. And I also think it bears mentioning, at the risk of sounding like crazy cautious, I do think that what's going on in your own local emergency management system ought to inform you some. Because, you know, when you get on the highway, there's some risk of an accident, no matter how remote. And that's going to put you in a position where you might need that same emergency system. So right now, despite the fact that I assume I'm still protected from my vaccination, I have walked it back. And when this infection rate comes down and things are relatively safer in general out and about in the community, I will probably start to engage in small group activities indoors with other people who are vaccinated, just like I was doing before. You know, Delta was really a game changer. We actually got a notice on our local news that we might have to go to a boil water alert because apparently the water systems for the city, the county, or whoever it is, the sanitation systems rely on liquid oxygen, and oxygen is being diverted over to the hospitals. So they're running low on oxygen that's used for the purpose of cleaning the water. And just to give people a sense of how much oxygen people need in the intensive care unit with COVID, I think most people know what a nasal cannula is. You see that little thing with two prongs that goes in the nose, and we use that in anesthesia. It's used sometimes in intensive care and other areas of the hospital as well. And a typical starting point would be about 2 to 3 liters per minute. It's measured in liters per minute. Anytime you have a cannula on, somebody's breathing spontaneously. So sometimes people, if they're too sleepy and their respirations slow down, you might turn that up to 4 or 5. That's a lot. People in the COVID intensive care are on 50 liters a minute of oxygen. Can you just think about 50 liters? Think about a 2 liter bottle of Coke or something. Okay, 25 of those per minute. Yeah, I don't know how this is going to end. I see, like I said on an earlier video, peaks and valleys and periods where we can enjoy a little more relative freedom, and then other times where, the infection rate goes back up, the bad weather comes in, and we're going to have to dial it back. And I see a lot more outdoor activities in my future, a lot less of indoor anything. Yeah, so that's my big analogy. I don't know, maybe it's not worth like a video over it, but I feel like I've been trying for a long time to articulate to people just how I try to keep in mind all these different moving parts and distill it down to a decision. There's all the parts that you do have some control over, like your mask or respirator, your eye protection, how much distance there is, how much time you're indoors, windows open and things like that. And then there's some things that you really can't control. I just think it's a little more complicated than what mask should I wear right now? Or is it okay to be indoors under these circumstances with this many people? I don't know. Are the windows open? Are fans running? Are they all wearing masks? How long is it going to be for? It's always important to keep in mind all these different moving parts. And I think that I've kind of internalized that in my head just from the work I do, because in anesthesia, that's what we're doing. We're always gathering this data from all these different machines and watching the patient. And every few minutes, sometimes you have to reprioritize and things get distilled down into the decision. And I'm trying to come up with a way to convey that to people when it comes to how you handle yourself and your mitigation measures in this pandemic. In the meantime, I'm assuming that everybody who watches my channel pretty much is vaccinated. If you're not, I really hope you'll consider getting vaccinated, because really the evidence is just unequivocal anymore. And I just don't know how much more, I don't know how much longer we can go through this. And I don't know what another variant somewhere down the road is going to look like. I actually watched a video that I'm going to link down below in the description box. It was some, like the Mayo Clinic's Grand Rounds or something like that. They had a vaccinologist who was presenting, and there was also some very interesting QA, and he talks about his predictions and how this is going to go. And he does talk about these analogies about how mitigation measures are layered. And I thought that was just a really good way to say that. And it started to crystallize in my head how I was thinking. So let me know if this was helpful. And until next time, be well.